What are elections about? If you talk to political consultants, they'll tell you that elections are about the future. You've got to have a big optimistic message about the future, like this cipher pretty boy, globalist pretty boy who's just won the French election. His stirring message is En Marche, which means forward, which is a perfectly empty yet supposedly optimistic and future-oriented slogan could hardly be bettered. But in fact, for most people, when they're in the voting booth, they're voting on the world they live in. And they're voting on the assumptions of the present. And for the most part, they assume that the agreeable present is going to continue, which is why things generally in democratic societies have to get pretty bad. And the present, in fact, has to more or less become terminated for people to take a flyer on the future. So we had an election in France between one candidate who offered in his vacuous slogan all the assumptions that the present would endure, the moment would endure, and one would live in that sweet moment eternally, as Goethe's Faust did. A parable, by the way, with much to commend it to the present state of the European Union. And the contrasting candidate, Marine Le Pen, basically said this can't last. If you're having a bad time now, it's going to be worse in 5 years and worse still in 10 years. And only 1 in 3 French voters were prepared to mark their ballot for her. So it was a consequential election, but in the end, the guy who won by pretending it was an election about nothing, and that there are no great questions. The days before the election, the French election was on Sunday, on Friday and Saturday, 6,000 so-called refugees were admitted to Italy by the European security agency Frontex. It's actually a highly misnamed security agency because it doesn't secure anything except the well-being of the so-called refugees that it rescues from the Mediterranean and brings to European soil, where they then go on welfare and prove impossible to deport to wherever they originally came from. As long as you can get a certain way out into the Mediterranean from the Libyan coastline, when you're picked up by Frontex, you will be settled in Italy or some other European country. If you have the misfortune to your little ramshackle boat sinks 30 yards off the Libyan coast, tough, you'll have to go back to Libya. But most of them make it out a little further that way, and the so-called European Security Agency then rescues them, dries them off, and imports them into the European Union. And this means something. 6,000 on Friday and Saturday, the 2 days before the French election. It's actually more consequential than what happened in the French election, because those 6,000 admitted to Italy are the future. And M Macron, the 12-year-old boy charmer who is supposedly going to take France forward, in fact, represents the past. And we never talk about the big issues like that, like those 6,000 arriving in Italy on Friday and Saturday and what it means. Global population throughout the 21st century is expected to increase from 6 billion at the beginning of the century to 9 billion by century's end. And that's actually a huge increase. That's a lot of people. It's only a couple of years. If you're old enough, you may remember that when someone died, they used to say, oh, he's gone to join the great majority, because there were more people in heaven than were living on earth, or than had ever lived on earth. In other words, most people are dead people and they're in heaven, and it was a relatively small number of people on Earth. And a few years ago, we crossed the threshold. There are now more people on the planet today than have ever lived in all of human history. And we're going from 6 billion at the beginning of the 21st century to 9 billion by the end of the century. And if you're one of these people who professes to be concerned about population control, population division, we have to have, for the sake of the environment, we've got to be responsible about the number of children we have. You think of that 9 billion as one nice big round sum. No distinctions between them, as if the whole planet is just some global parking lot with 9 billion vehicles parked in it. But in fact, that population increase is not distributed evenly. And almost all the population growth between now and the end of the century is going to come from the Muslim world and sub-Saharan Africa. And not to put too fine a point upon it, that means the population growth is going to come in areas of the world that contribute absolutely nothing to the economic dynamism of the planet. I'd like to show you something. I'd like to show you a graph. Steve Saylor, who's a very clever chap, and he has an analytic bent, which a lot of us in the commentariat, to be honest, don't have. So if he sees a couple of interesting numbers in some obscure report by a UN agency, he'll put them all out on a spreadsheet and take a look at them at what they really mean and what's underpinning them. And a couple of years ago, he looked at the statistics from the UN Population Division and decided to put them into one handy little graph. And this is the graph. It's basically the 2012 UN Population Division report, Population Projections. And it's easy to follow. That blue line is Europe. And Europe, from 1950 to the end of the 21st century, is basically flatlined at 500 million people. And this yellow line is Africa. And if you go back to 1950, Africa had about half the population of Europe. At the beginning of this century, it caught up with Europe. Okay, that's actually quite extraordinary in itself, that Africa's population caught up with Europe's beginning of the 21st century. And from there on in, it is going to soar. It is going to soar to over 4 billion people. Over 4 billion people, or getting on for 2/3 of what the planet's total population was at the beginning of this century. Europe flatlined at 500 million, Africa at 4.25 billion. What does that mean? Is that more important than whether that nice Monsieur Macron seems so much more pleasant and agreeable than Madame Le Pen? It means something. Steve Saylor calls this the most important graph of our time, and it is. The Mediterranean is a very narrow body of water that separates the developed world from what is frankly the most dysfunctional part of the developing world, which is what Africa is. And those 6,000 people who entered Italy on Friday and Saturday, they're making a very rational decision. They're making the same rational decision that anybody would make when you have somewhere that is squalid and intolerable next to somewhere that is boundlessly wealthy and in terms of its welfare payments, extravagant beyond anybody's wildest dreams in Africa. These figures, we don't think of it in those terms. Everybody over a certain age somehow still thinks that yes, Africans have a lot of children, but most of them die in childbirth, so what's the big deal? In fact, infant mortality, they've made enormous strides in Africa, mainly thanks, of course, to Western medicine, and as a result, if you have a ton of children, the chances are they're all going to be alive and well in a country that cannot support that number of people. Meanwhile, you have Europe, where increasingly large numbers of people have no children. 30% of German women are childless. Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, is one of them. Her new friend, Monsieur Macron, doesn't have any children either, since he ran off with his high school drama teacher, whom he fell in love with at the age of 15. He has no progeny of his own. Of the 6 founding members of the European Union, as I mentioned at Steyn Online the other day, 5 of those leaders, the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, have no children. The Belgian guy has 2 kids. And actually that's basically a quirk of Belgium's intractable politics, because he took over from some gay guy who was also childless. But one of the rare surviving heterosexuals in Belgium has now taken over, and he has 2 kids for 6 prime ministers. That is Europe's demography writ small. So you've got this fantastic, highly developed real estate with shrinking numbers of people in it. And meanwhile, you have just across a narrow body of water a vast continent in which the population has gone from 250 million in 1950 to over 4 billion by the end of this century. And that has consequences. It's asking too much to expect people to stay in those dysfunctional societies. If you know about American immigration, you'll know they have this stupid thing called the Visa card lottery. So it's like a game show to get a green card to go to America. It's like tri-state megabucks, but for green cards. And lots of different countries, you have to be a citizen of certain countries to apply for them. It's some boondoggle. It's countries that are supposed to be underrepresented in the great American tapestry. And the various countries put in to apply for the green card lottery. 7% of the population of Ghana has got an application in for the current US green card lottery. So if you're thinking, well, Ghanaians are totally unrepresented, if they all get lucky, 7% of Ghana's population is going to be moving to the United States. And I found this rather poignant as an old 19th century imperialist, because I remember learning at school that Ghana was the first colony in Africa to become independent. 1957. Look at this lovely picture. This is your multicultural diversity right here. That parasol is over Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Kent, representing Her Majesty the Queen, and behind her the last colonial governor of the Gold Coast and the first Governor General of independent Ghana, Sir Charles Noble Arden Clark, GCMG. How's that for a viceregal moniker? Sir Charles Noble Arden Clark, GCMG. And here's a little stamp they issued. Look, that's the Gold Coast stamp there with the Queen on it, and they overmarked it for Ghanaian independence, March 1957, almost exactly 6 decades ago. And Ghana was the first British colony in Africa, black British colony, to become self-governing. And 6 decades later, they did such a bang-up job of it that 7% of the population have applied for the US green card lottery. There's a kind of tragedy about what has happened in Africa. It's a country that has been, it's a continent that has been sorely mismanaged. And yet the one thing that it produces in abundance are people. I met several Ghanaians pretending to be Syrian last year in a German refugee house in Reutlingen. I met, I think it was 3 Ghanaians and a rather larger number of Gambians, many other fellas from British West Africa. all of whom had figured that it was worth pretending, even though no one in their right mind would ever believe they were seriously Syrian. If you were a 33-year-old Ghanaian, it was worth pretending to be a 17-year-old Syrian and getting to live off German welfare. Let's take somewhere else in West Africa, Niger. Niger, in the first decade of this century, increased its population by 50%, from just over 10 million to just over 15 million. Now, before it did this, at the beginning of the century, in 2000, over 500,000 children in Niger were estimated to be starving. So it couldn't even feed the population it had when it had 10 million people. So, in the course of 10 years, it's increased its population to 15 million. Its population is predicted to hit just under 100 million by the end of this century in a country that can't feed a people 1/10 its size. Is it remotely likely that an extra 90 million people will choose to stay within Niger? Especially when Angela Merkel and M Macron and all kinds of other people have effectively told them that and the European Security Agency, Frontex, have basically told them that if you can make a short boat trip, not all the way across the Mediterranean, but just a couple of 100 yards out from those Libyan ports, you can walk into Europe and take it. Steve Saylor is right. This is the most consequential graph, most important graph of our time. What's the answer to this? I said I'm an old school imperialist. You can't do imperialism. The British ran the biggest empire the world has ever known. They governed a quarter of the world's population with a very light footprint. You cannot come up, even on the lightest footprint model, with enough people to administer West Africa when the population differential between your country and theirs is now so vast. In a democratic age, who the majority of the people are has huge consequences. And it would be interesting to me if we were able to talk about this. The lesson of the French election, where according to polls, 1 in 2 voters think that there is too much mass immigration to France, the lesson of the French election is nevertheless that if you demonize your opponent, people who agree with that statement, people who think there is too much mass immigration, will nevertheless vote for a candidate who is pledged to continue with unprecedented demographic transformation. It is the biggest story of our time. And I think everyone understands that at a certain point you reach a tipping point. That you're bringing in too many people for who have too minimal a purchase on the society they live in. You already see that in Sweden, for example, where they have a hugely distorted sex differential because they've imported so many young Muslim men for whom there are insufficient girls. So they now have such a distorted sex cohort between boys and girls that normally it takes a huge big war to achieve. And in that case, they kill all the boys, and it's the girls who find the opposite sex in short supply. Everyone understands that at some point, demographic transformation reaches a tipping point. What they don't understand, I think, is how quickly it can happen. And the reality of that graph is a challenge for everyone in Europe. For Europeans who barely bother reproducing at all and have imported vast numbers of people to be the children they couldn't be bothered having themselves, these things will utterly transform their society. A couple of years ago, my daughter and I were in the United Kingdom, and she wanted to go to something called a zombie shopping mall. And I had no interest in zombie shopping malls. I thought it was just going to be one of these lame lame theme parks like you get in Florida or wherever, where they spend the first half an hour showing you how to get into the safety harness, and it's all too antiseptic and anaesthetized. But in fact, it was actually quite interesting because they used an actual shopping mall that had closed. So it was a real shopping mall with all real chain stores in them, the British equivalent of, McDonald's and J.C. Penney and Payless Shoe Sauce, but utterly ruined and with like zombies rampaging through them and preying on people like my daughter as the zombie apocalypse loomed. And somebody said to me the other day, do you think these zombie films are meant to actually be a metaphor for immigration? I said I would very much doubt it, given the disposition of the people who make the zombie films. But even if they're not, they don't function badly at that level. That's what Europe is going to be looking like. It's going to be a country it's going to be a continent that cannot defend itself. It's going to be a continent that will not be able, even when Frontex figures out that it's not a good idea just to bring thousands and thousands of people to Europe's shores every day, they will not be able to stop people from just walking in. And you would do it too. If you lived in Ghana and you lived in Niger and your cousin's friend has a cell phone and keeps sending you pictures of how nice it is to be in Malmo, or how nice it is to be in Reutlingen, or how nice it is to be even in Clichy-sous-Bois or the other Paris banlieue, you would do it too. Because you would say, these people don't want their continent. They believe in nothing. They don't even bother breeding. Let's just walk in and take it. And the question, when you look at that map, that graph, is what's going to stop them? What's going to prevent them? That graph happens every day in the number of people that Frontex picks up and drops off on the shores of Europe. And it happens back in Africa too, where the gulf between a population explosion and the shriveled, barren wombs of Europe grows larger every single day. We'll see you next time.